Okay, let's start. Hello, everyone. We're very pleased to introduce our NEWAVE second distinguished lecture, Why Science Doesn't Speak with One Voice, featuring Professor Silvio Funtowicz, that is here with us, and we are very honored to welcome. So the seminar of today, which is hosted by NEWAVE, the next water governance innovative training network, of which I am the coordinator, will explore the concept of post-normal science, which emerged as a problem-solving strategy that is appropriate when facts are uncertain, values are in conflict, stakes are high, and decisions are urgent. Professor Funtowicz will discuss why the use of post-normal science is necessary and will argue for a broader concept of useful knowledge in the context of governance. Professor Silvio Funtowicz began his career teaching mathematics, logic, and research methodology in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where he was born. During the 1980s, he was a research fellow at the University of Leeds, and until his retirement in 2011, he was a scientific officer at the Joint Research Center at the European Commission. From 2012 until recently, he was a professor at the Center for the Study of the Sciences and the Humanities at University of Bergen. Professor Funtowicz is a philosopher of science active in the field of science and technology studies. Some of his articles, such as The Worth of a Songbird, Ecological Economics as a Post-Normal Science, or Science for the Post-Normal Age, are real classics in our field. Post-normal science, which Professor Funtowicz, together with Jeremy Ravetz, defined in the early 90s, has radically affected and to a certain extent defined the epistemological foundations of sustainability science, ecological economics, and complexity studies. And despite the fact that the concept of post-normal science was introduced in the 90s, this perspective is still very useful and fit to address debates on contemporary wicked problems. And so with this, I would like to invite you, Professor Funtowicz, and thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. I will start sharing my screen, and let's see. I hope it works. Okay. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and let me first tell you that I'm not an expert in water or in water issues, but I have a long experience dealing with complex socio-technical systems. And I want to share with you this experience so you could see what type of similarities or differences are among different type of complex socio-technical systems in the context of governments, and then see how this can be deployed and apply in your own area of expertise. Now, I decided for today to use this title, Why Science Doesn't Speak with One Voice. And it is from a problem, a societal, scientific problem for our society has been quite important in the last couple of years, and that's the COVID pandemic. And I took the title from an article in an Italian newspaper where an immunologist, a member of the scientific and technical committee advising on the pandemics, published or was interviewed at this Corriere della Sera, and he argued that science had to apologize to the Italian people because they were not able to speak with one voice. Okay, so the idea was that science has to apologize because it was unable to speak with one voice. Now, a second, on the same opinion, on the same subject, comes from David Spiegelhalter, this time who was a member of the committee advising the government, but in the UK, and he has a completely different idea. And he says, the science does tell you what to do. How can you ever follow the science? And I want to remind you that in most countries, and you can think about your own, governments and administrators and politicians say, we are following the science, okay? So he said, how can following the science be true when the same science produces dramatically different opinions among scientists, but what it is to be done? And he finally argues that it's an awful phrase, and mainly because it gives you the impression that if you know the science, you know what to do. Now, here, I leave it for you to reflect on some questions coming from these two opinions from scientists, experts, who advise their respective governments on what to do in a complex socio-technical, scientific issue like the pandemic. And so the question is, can science speak with one voice? The second, should science speak with one voice? And the third, does knowing the relevant science mean that you know what to do? And now, these are important questions. And the fact that clever and very able experts, very bright in their fields and disciplines, believe that it is possible for science to speak with one voice, and also that if you know the science, you know what to do. Well, it's not just by chance, but it has a very long history, which really starts with the emergence of the modern state. And by the way, also of modern science. And what was the main problem-solving strategy when societal has a practical political problem? Well, what you do is you translate the practical political problem into a technical scientific problem. You solve the technical problem, and you believe that you have also solved the practical problem. Now, that worked quite successfully in the sense that this translation of practical problems, political problems into technoscientific problems produced important results. The development of science, the development of technology, and the development of governance institutions. And that started to happen in Europe with the emergence of the modern state after the treaties of Westphalia around middle of 1650. Now, it was the results, I say, successful in the sense that we can see an incredible development and progress, as I say, science, technology, and institutions. On the other hand, it enabled small European states to become important colonial powers. Now, as I say, this works quite well when you can reduce or translate a problem that it is practical into a technical, but that assumes that you have reduced complexity. And historically, the way in which modern science and this type of problem-solving strategy work was to reduce complexity by in two ways. The first one is to separate the system and the study from its context. So the assumption is that you can separate it, externalize the context, the environment from the system that you are studying, because the relations between the system and the study and its environment are not so important. And your system is quite stable and isolated. The second one is to separate ourselves from the object that we study. In that way, what we have is that our body doesn't interfere. So our persona is an externality to the study of the system. Now, these are two important ways in which complexity was reduced, and it was quite successful insofar as that it enabled simple problems to become translated and solved technically. Now, it is important for you to think about that. The idea that we are not entangled with the system we are studying, and the system we are studying is quite stable and doesn't have important relation with its environment. This is a way of reducing uncertainty, and it worked well, but now we have to ask ourselves what happened when it is clear that the system and the study cannot be separated from its environment, and second, when our bodies, our personas, ourselves are influencing and entangled completely with the system we are studying. In that sense, this type of problem-solving strategy has shown its limitations, as I say, as in the case of COVID. Now, one of the interesting elements that we have learned from the COVID is that we had experts all over the world that express uncertainty, ignorance about what they knew, and also ignorance about what they didn't know, and also that they were arguing in public, not only among disciplines, but also inside disciplines. Now, controversies in science are not uncommon, but mainly we believe that these are usually in the social sciences and the humanities. But in this case, we saw people in the hard science, the exact science, virology, immunology, epidemiology, so on and so forth, people arguing quite strongly in public. Okay, now, and that was the first time I think that many people started to think that really science doesn't speak with one voice. Why they can't agree? Or why someone, an expert in immunology, I showed it, believes that science has to apologize to the citizens because it couldn't speak with one voice. Now, as I say, many were surprised, not only by the uncertainty, this very strong uncertainty, also about the controversy, but also about the passion that these experts were showing in their arguments and discussions, okay? Now, people were surprised. We were not. And why not? Oh, because 40 years ago, we were working on a different problem, but also a very complex techno-scientific problem, techno-social scientific problem. And that was the possible relation between emissions from a civil nuclear power station and clusters of child leukemia. Okay, so the question was, is there a relation? Can we attribute the emissions from that complex technical systems and the existence of clusters of child leukemia? And and this is a book in which I participated with other researchers. What we found is that epidemiologists, modelers, radiobiological models, and local doctors disagree. Not only they disagree across areas of expertise, but also they disagree among themselves. So 40 years ago, we already had examples that were dealing with complex techno-social scientific issues of this type. We had strong disagreements among disciplines and in disciplines themselves. And 40 years ago, we were not surprised either. And why is that? Well, because in the 70s, a nuclear engineer called Alvin Weinberg was working in a problem almost similar to the one we were talking before, that we were working in the 80s in the United Kingdom. And that was, can we establish a link between emissions from a nuclear power station and health or environmental effects? And he comes to the conclusion that we can't. And he coins the term trans science in order to characterize a type of problems where, and this is important, where you can express them scientifically, but you cannot solve them scientifically. So it's a way, far away from the problem-solving strategy I mentioned from the modern state at the beginning, where the whole work was to translate a practical problem into a scientific problem. Then you solve a scientific problem, and then you have solved the practical problem. What Alvin Weinberg argued is that that's not possible. Now, we don't have time now, but if you are interested, we can talk during the later the question time, is what does it mean to express a problem scientifically? And what does it mean to solve a problem scientifically? What does it mean to solve? You know, there is not a unified view about what does it mean to solve a problem scientifically. And the distinction between science and non-science has changed over time. So it is important that we realize that at a certain moment of time, people began to think that when you are dealing with this type of complex type of problems, there are times where it's or difficult to find a solution or impossible to find a solution. Okay? Now, what I'm saying is, remember, I said, well, what does it mean to solve a problem scientifically? At the time in the 70s or 60s, it was an idea about what the experimental method and field work and all those type of things. But it was the beginning also of big computing and systems analysis. And in this slide, and that was, I wanted to mention the idea that Sam, Harvey Brooks, for example, and others in relation to systems analysis and simulation models argued also that they are also trans-scientific problems. And not only that, here we have the idea that the administrator in the 80s of the US Environmental Protection Agency arguing that all the environmental problems we had to deal with were trans-scientific problems. So we are a long way from, as I say, the traditional idea that in order to solve a practical political problem, what you have to do is to reduce it into scientific technical problems, you solve it, and then you have solved the technical and political problem. Now, that was one of the reasons why we were not surprised about disagreements, controversies, and also the strong uncertainty bordering into ignorance that where we will handle the COVID pandemic or similar problem. And the other reason that we were not surprised is because of the emergence of what it was called popular epidemiology. And popular epidemiology was created by a community of citizens that were affected by risks to health or their own environment. And they couldn't see that accredited experts, administrators, or politicians were interested. So they realized they had to create their own knowledge base. An example of that, a paradigmatic case, I would say, of citizen science, we call it today, or popular epidemiology, was the case of Love Canal. And here what I have is a paper by a colleague of mine at the University of Bergen, Ragnar Fjelland, who wrote a book about when lay people are right and experts are wrong, lessons from Love Canal. Now, today, this idea that citizens can create knowledge, relevant knowledge, useful knowledge to resolve problems affecting them in their communities, in their place where they live, well, it has been called today undone science. Undone because it's science that's not done by experts and accredited scientists. So the community have to take for themselves the task of creating this useful knowledge. In the case of water, perhaps you all know the case of Flint in the USA. Well, that was a water case, a complex water case, where it fits the whole thing that we are talking, a complex issue, experts and politicians, administrators not interested, so the community has to take in their own hands the task of creating useful knowledge. Now, what did we learn from all this? Meaning almost 50 years that we know that when dealing with complex socio-political technical issues, experts disagree, they don't speak with one voice, and they can tell us what to do. Well, what we learned is we concluded the need to create, as Campbell, when he introduced me, mentioned, introduce a new strategy to deal with these complex problems. And by that, I will introduce now post-normal science. Now, post-normal science reduced to the minimum is just two things, okay? The first is a mantra, which is here, and the other is an iconic diagram. The mantra defines what is a post-normal problem or what are the post-normal conditions. And they are as follows. Facts are uncertain, values are plural and in dispute, the stakes involved are potentially high, and decisions are urgent. Now, you could see immediately, I think all of you can give examples in the case of COVID, because we all became experts in COVID during the last 2 years, but it's clear that these have a very particular conditions. These are particular conditions which differ substantially from our idea about modern science. The first is facts are uncertain. And in this case, I will invite you to reflect, how can a fact be uncertain? Okay, and from there, we go to the idea is that we have to think carefully when we talk about what constitutes evidence. In particular, quantitative evidence. The other three, about the plurality of values, about the stakes, what is involved, and the need for urgent decisions, were always considered externalities to science. What values? Values are different from facts, and science deals with facts, right? So values are not relevant. The same about what is at stake or that decisions are urgent. Okay. Now, before passing to the diagram, I want to mention, because I said complex many times. And you know, complex is not the same as complicated. I don't have time to go into all the details, but let's imagine that by a complex issue implies the existence of a plurality of legitimate perspectives that cannot be reduced one to the other. It's a bit you have to think about it, but what I mean is that there is not one overarching perspective that will comprehend all the legitimate perspectives around the issue. That's a definition of complexity. Now, and what we argue is that when you are in a post-normal situation that is defined by the mantra, then we have to put into brackets some of the important ideals of science. For example, truth. Okay, I'm not saying that science, truth is not important, okay? Just remember, what I'm saying is that because of the problem at hand, we have to bracket truth and think in terms of quality. Now, there is, perhaps we can talk later what's the difference between truth and quality, but quality is defined as fitness for purpose. How good is an input, a product, a process to this decision-making process that fits a social purpose? And the purpose is the result of a socially constructed political process. So that's the purpose, that's the function. So in these cases, what we have to do is to create high quality knowledge that fits the purposes that we have decided together. So, so the job is to decide, why are we doing it? No? And then see how can we define the problem, and then what would be the necessary, useful, high quality knowledge necessary. Okay, so what we argue that, and you can see in the diagram, that you have systems, the uncertainty, and you have decision stakes, what is at stake. And important, uncertainty and stakes are not independent dimensions. And later I can explain more if you are interested. But what the idea of the diagram is that as soon as you start going out from the center towards a high uncertainty or high stakes, the community that evaluates quality is expanded, extended. Okay, it's quite simple. When you are in science, disciplinary science, applied science, quality is judged by your colleagues, the people who had your same degrees, published in the same journals, and so on. It's called peer review or refereeing. When you are in professional type of activities, engineering, medicine, architecture, veterinary, your community, the community of people judging quality is extended, you know. And so if you don't like what an engineer says, you go to a second engineer and you don't expect them to have the same opinion. It's the same with the second opinion in medicine. And the fact that society has recognized that because uncertainties, stakes, and the role of values and judgment, they have a different, what we call, social contract with society. Okay, so there are more people, roles, actors involved in judging the quality of professionals that they are in science. And what we argue that if you go beyond that, in a situation of very high uncertainties or very high stakes, well, this community that we call extended peer communities become the rightful place where quality is judged. Now, and the task is precisely to create these extended peer communities in order to establish what's the purpose, what is the suitable, useful knowledge base, and who participates in the resolution of the political issue. Now, well, it's not only COVID or the cases I mentioned, but if you think about other challenges facing humanities, we have the same post-normal conditions. And that is climate change, ecosystems collapse, biodiversity loss, and sustainability transitions. There is uncertainty, there is conflict among value systems, there are high stakes involved, and decisions are quite urgent. I mean, you have seen the recent reports by IPCC or by IPBES about the need to do something, not today, yesterday. And these are all share what we call the conditions that I mentioned before. And for that, therefore, the need to create extended peer communities and try to obtain high quality knowledge in order also to establish what are the purpose. What does it mean, a solution? And it's not only climate change, but what is more? What is the context? What we see is that these post-normal conditions are not in a vacuum, not in a social political institutional vacuum, are in a context that we can call of intolerable inequalities, social, economic, etc., you name it. Weak democratic institutions, authoritarian tendencies, and a magical idea about the role of science in society. The idea that they are silver bullets. Okay. Now, it's interesting because you think about all the issues I mentioned before and how there are ideas about how a silver bullet, a technical innovation will solve the problem and the practical problem. Now, what we have seen, and let me start trying to summarize the idea. I started with a complex problem that we all share during the last couple of years. The idea that science doesn't speak with one voice. The question is that if it can't speak with one voice, how can we think that it should speak with one voice? The second element is that knowing the science is important, but it doesn't mean that it tells you what to do. Okay, so that was credible when you could think about practical political problems as simple or even complicated problems. It is no longer credible when problems are complex, meaning the translation of a practical or social problem to a scientific or technical is not one-to-one. It's not predetermined. So you have a situation where, because of values, etc., context, and so on and so forth, what you have is that a practical political problem can be translated into many different scientific or technical questions. So the problem is again devolved to the democratic process. Who and how do we decide which is the problem to solve? Now, as I say, we have seen, and we have seen, so many people have seen in the last 2 years, but we that have been dealing with complex systems for 50 years have seen a long time ago that science doesn't speak with one voice. And that's not the problem. The problem is that people believe, or the people who believe that it should speak, that it can speak with one voice. The other element that we haven't yet created a general awareness is that as science doesn't speak with one voice, knowledge doesn't speak only the language of science. Important challenges in human history have been solved not by science, but by other forms of knowledge. And if you want, we can give examples in the past, but you can, from your own experience, think about that. So practical political problems have been solved by humanity many times in the past, and they were not solved by science. We are lucky to have a good science, but we shouldn't forget that there are other forms of knowledge that have been useful and continue to be useful and will be useful also in the future when dealing with these complex societal issues. Now, to finish, the argument is during the 30s, an important group in the philosophy of science based in Vienna, it was called the Vienna Circle, proposed the idea of an orchestration of disciplines in order to approach practical problems. Well, that's okay. That's good. That is what we call interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, so on and so forth. But really, postnormal science promotes transdisciplinarity. And that is to recognize other forms of knowledge. So the idea is, together with this orchestration of scientific disciplines, we have to create choreographies of knowledges and think about how, and I call it choreography to say that it can take many forms. How can we put together these extended peer communities to try to solve the fundamental challenges we are facing in a situation of a deep conflict? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvio. Thanks for the fantastic lecture. So I would like to invite all of our participants, several participants from different parts of the world, to ask questions in the Q&A chat. And I see a first question popping up here, which is stating the following: would other forms of knowledge include intuition, embodiment practices, or spiritual practices?
Yes, of course. And remember, even intuition has a role to play in science. And your body and so on, and practical skills, craft skills have always been part, not only of knowledge, but also part of science, right? So what I'm saying is yes, and once you start thinking about the process and about enlargement and about the need to find shared purposes and problem-solving strategies, you necessarily have to include people who have different ideas about what knowledge means, okay? What knowledge means, how knowledge is done, how knowledge is practiced. So we talked about practical knowledge. Remember that one of the most important problems in navigation, which is the creation of longitude, okay? The establishment of longitude was done by a clockmaker and not by the members of the Royal Society. And so what it means is that knowing your place, your community, in your situation or your context is an important part. How do you know that? Well, there are different ways of knowing. And it's not only knowing how, but it is also knowing that.
Thanks a lot. So a few questions are popping up here in the chat. And there is a question from Daval Joshi. They are asking, given that current policy governance spaces are helmed by scientific agencies and professionals, are there any current examples of spaces that provide scope for integrating other knowledges?
Well, you have to remember that not even a revolutionary transdisciplinary, but a simple interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary is an important change in the balance of power. And that everybody that works in a research institute, a university, whatever, knows that very well. It is challenges, okay, institutions and power. So I didn't mention power, but I think it was implicit in what I said. So the argument is we have to create the spaces for going beyond. And this is happening. If you think about it, think about IPBES, working with biodiversity. If you look at it, you will see already happening the need to, I won't say integrate, but coordinate different types of knowledges. If you go to the reports, and everywhere, that's my position. We shouldn't ask for permission. Okay, we have to create the spaces, and you have powers to do it. Just do it in the same way as the context and our bodies didn't have to ask permission to become, to people be aware that these are complex problems. It's like, you know, occupy the problem, right? Occupy the problem. The same way as nature has occupied also the systems we study.
A few years ago, it was about occupying Wall Street. I think now we can.
Well, this is a process of democratization of science, democratization of mathematics is, you know, opening up to be able to participate in this idea of undone science, you know, because certain science is not done. And we have to change, as we argue, what is the meaning of science today? And that's a problem of philosophy of science, epistemology, called the demarcation problem, no? And that has changed during time, and it should continue to change.
There is another question from an anonymous participant who's thanking you for the inspiring talk and is asking, would it be correct to say that one among many obstacles related to the creation of such a choreography are the ontological gaps between different levels of reality, from molecules to institutions?
Well, yes, it's a difficult question, but in principle, I already said that there are a multiplicity of ontologies, okay? A plurality of ontologies in the same way as there are a multiplicity or plurality of epistemologies. Now, one of the problems we are seeing today is that there is a collapse of a shared reality. If you think about it, what it's called the post-truth, whatever it is, okay, it shows that, you know, I didn't say when I was talking, but Aristotle defined truth as a relation between what we say and what happens, okay? If outside, in reality, if there is a coincidence between what we say, we are saying the truth. If it is not, we are not saying the truth. But for that, we have to agree that this external reality we all share. And I think that's today under discussion. So the first thing we have to do is precisely try to create this shared reality in which we can construct, you know, useful common purposes. Because otherwise, even if we cannot say, live in the same or in a similar or in a shared reality, how can we think about a common future?
So I would like to ask a question myself. Speaking about truth, we clearly saw how in many instances the notion of truth has been politicized in both ways, and of course the recent discussions about COVID. But I would like to go back to the debate and the climate skepticism, and how, for example, certain administrations have referred to the climate change as a political issue. In the United States, in certain states, the term climate change is actually prohibited from governmental and public discourses. There are quite some strong paradoxes. But how would you relate with the notion of truth and fake news in this context?
Okay, it is an important question. Now, later I might share with you a short 10-11-minute YouTube I did on precisely uncertainty and politicization, and that was in a meeting. In a conference we had in Surrey, precisely about the politicization of uncertainty. I'll try to be brief. I'll try to be brief. When I started to work on uncertainty more than 40 years ago, uncertainty was not recognized in the sense of uncertainty that couldn't be reduced quantitatively through technical means, probabilities, etc. It was not recognized. So when we were criticizing that, we were using uncertainty politically. All the opposition to some techno-scientific systems progress was politically motivated, but it had a base precisely in the idea that there is uncertainty that cannot be reduced to quantities. And therefore, there are problems in the paradigm of prediction and control. Now, what happened is when we all remember, I think I'm old, but in 92, 93, there was the United Nations Conference on the Environment in Rio de Janeiro. And there in a chapter on, the chapter on Agenda 21, which is sustainability, there was something that was called the precautionary principle, okay? And it was all about uncertainty. How can you act legitimately from a political point of view, make decisions when you have uncertain science? You don't have a good science, okay? And if you look at it, the word uncertainty is not mentioned. Why? Because there were people who didn't want to associate the word uncertainty with science. Uncertainty was not the problem. You just quantify it using mathematical techniques or whatever, and then that's it. So, and then what happened? A few years after, started to appear books and papers saying about the strategic use of uncertainty, the fabrication, the manufacturing of uncertainty. I remember that the discussion about that didn't start with climate. It started with big pharma, tobacco, and agribusiness. And there are books on the subject, David Michaels and others, that talk about precisely the strategic use by lobbies of uncertainty in order to fight regulation. So it's what happened in these 40 years is that everybody has learned how to play the uncertainty game. And not only that, the fact, we learned two things, and I don't want to take all the time, but the first one, what we learned is that, as I say, everybody has learned how to play the uncertainty game. Two, that how easy it is to create uncertainty. Post-normal side. The third is that this is a problem because of the strong relation between truth and the good that comes from the modern state, the system that I mentioned before. So why should we care if there is scientific uncertainty, if we want to protect the environment, right? So you see, so we have always translated normative issues into scientific technical issues, and that doesn't work anymore.
Thank you. And also thanks from Dr. Fantini, who's a member of the NEWAVE network, and he's asking if quality is fit for purpose, who and how decide about what the purpose should be in a context of plurality of values and stakes?
Yes. Okay. Yes, that's a good question. We have written a lot about that. And quality is fitness for purpose. Okay, fitness for purpose of function. That is how I don't have time, but I will be glad to give you a lecture also on quality, how to develop these ideas about quality. And I'm talking about quality of products, processes, and things of that type. Yes, in times of conflict, as I mentioned, in times of this uncertainty, of plurality, of conflicting values, what you have is very difficult to find a shared purpose. So people have concentrated, when they talk about participation, on co-production. No, the idea of co-producing knowledge. They have concentrated less on how you do it in the times of deep conflict. Now, so my answer is we cannot give it for granted and we have to create it, because unless we decide that the violence is the solution, we have to find ways of creating these shared purposes in order to have a common future. Now, you could say that's utopian. Okay, good. But otherwise, so the main question, and I feel that, is not what to do, but how to do it in a context of bounded violence.
Thanks a lot. And yeah, this applies particularly now in the hard and difficult geopolitical moment that we're living. There is a last question. We're running out of time, but I don't want to let it go. So again, thank you for this amazing talk from an anonymous participant. And the question is post-normal science and trans science the same? How can we help the general public understand this new paradigm in science? And how can this understanding, for example, affect the application of science in areas of criminal investigation, public health, climate change, urban development, and so forth?
Yes, okay. It's not the same because I'm sorry, I don't want to run because we have another meeting, but it's not the same. Otherwise, we shouldn't have used a different word. I mean, if you go back to Alwin Weinberg's definition of transscience, you will see that for Weinberg and all the others have used transscience, it's a problem of resources. So it's a time of time and resources. So reading the original ideas of Weinberg and all the rest, you say, well, if we had all the time in the world and all the money in the world, we might come to a solution. In post-normal science, we say that there's irreducible uncertainty and plurality of values. So even with all the time in the world, you have a thought experiment, okay? You cannot come back to the finalize with an answer that it is 42. I don't know if you remember The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where it's all an experiment run by rats in order to come to the main problems, and it is 42. No, it's not 42. We don't know. We don't know if it is 42. We don't know if it is any number. It's what we are going to create.
Thanks a lot, Professor Funtowicz. And I think with this, we reached the end of our wonderful lecture. And I want to thank all of our participants, with people from Kenya, Nigeria, Myanmar, Venezuela, Europe, and probably other countries. So thanks a lot. And to all of our participants, stay tuned with NEWAVE upcoming